Hide and Peep Thomas. On the island of Sodor, there are lots of engines that keep the railway running smoothly. Some are big and some are small. Some are standard gauge and some are narrow gauge. Standard gauge engines run on the main line, transporting both passengers and freight. Standard gauge engines can be steamies, diesels, and even logging locos. Thomas, Percy, Gordon, James, Diesel, Salty, and Ferdinand are all standard gauge engines. The narrow gauge engines run on the narrow gauge line. The narrow gauge railway is smaller in every way: the engines, the rolling stock, and even the tracks, which allow the engines to go higher up in the hills. Victor, Skarloey, Bernays, and Rusty are all narrow gauge engines. Whether big or small, standard gauge or narrow gauge, all engines on the Fat Controller's railway want to be really useful. The Thing Controller, Mr. Percival, is in charge and looks after all the narrow gauge engines, but he is especially fond of the engines that work at the Blue Mountain Quarry. Skarloey is one of the oldest engines on the narrow gauge railway and has his own branch line, the Skarloey Railway. He is kind and wise and watches over all the engines who work at the quarry. Peter Sam is green with a red buffer. He is happy and kind and is a very hard worker. He has a unique funnel. It is short and square and he is proud of it. Rusty is an orange diesel narrow gauge engine. He doesn't make white steam like the steam engines do, but chugs out black smoke instead. Rusty is a good friend to all the engines on Sodor. Sir Handel is a blue steam engine. When he was first built, he was called Falcon, but his name was changed to Sir Handel when he came to the island of Sodor. Bernays is a tough little engine with a long tall funnel, who works hard even if it means some scratches and scrapes. He has a fine sense of humour and keeps the engines at the quarry smiling. Owen is an enthusiastic traction engine. He sits on one side of the winch and pulls cargo trucks up and down the incline at the quarry. Merrick is a bright red sleepy crane. At times, his snores can be heard at the quarry. Merrick is loved by all the engines and has lots of tales to tell, as long as he stays awake long enough to tell them. One morning, Thomas and the Thing Controller chuffed into the narrow gauge transfer yard to collect some empty cargo trucks to take to the Blue Mountain Quarry. As Thomas collected them, the Thing Controller went to talk to Peter Sam. "Good morning, Peter Sam," said Mr. Percival. Thomas will be coming to the Blue Mountain Quarry to collect slate and take it to the docks. I need you to tell Skarloey and the other narrow gauge engines so they are ready for his arrival." "Yes, sir," puffed Peter Sam. But as Peter Sam chuffed away, an idea bubbled in his boiler. He thought it would be fun to play a trick on Thomas. When Thomas arrived at the Blue Mountain Quarry, he couldn't see any of his narrow gauge friends. "Where is everybody?" puffed Thomas. Just then, Skarloey chuffed out. "All the engines are playing Hide and Peep Thomas," said Skarloey. "You have to find them." "But I can't look for them up in the mountains. I'm too big for your narrow gauge tracks," said Thomas. "Then maybe you could ask someone to help you find some clues," said Skarloey. Thomas looked around. He couldn't see any of his narrow gauge friends, but he could see Owen the traction engine and Merrick the crane. "Maybe they could help me," chuffed Thomas. So Thomas asked Owen and Merrick if they had seen where the other engines had hidden. "Yes," said Owen. "I saw some engines go towards the gravel bunker." "You should look over there," said Merrick. Thomas thanked Owen and Merrick and chuffed over to the gravel bunker, but he couldn't see any engines there. Suddenly, he heard the sound of rumbling wheels coming from one side of the yard. I wonder who that is, puffed Thomas. I will follow the sound and find out. Thomas followed the sound of the rumbling wheels, but he still couldn't find any of his narrow gauge friends. Suddenly, Thomas saw a tunnel, which had dark smoke coming out of it. I've nearly found someone, laughed Thomas. But who could it be? Who do you think Thomas has found? It's Rusty, the diesel engine who works at the Blue Mountain Quarry. Hello, Thomas, said Rusty. Hello, Rusty. Do you know where the other narrow gauge engines are? Asked Thomas. They are hiding, Thomas, answered Rusty. You have to look for clues around the quarry. Thomas looked up high and down low. Then he saw some white steam coming out of a tunnel. Who's there? Shouted Thomas. I found you! Who puffs out white steam? Out puffed Sir Handel. You are very good at this game, Thomas, said Sir Handel. Thomas then heard a loud steam whistle. Which narrow gauge engine has a whistle like that? Thomas followed the sound of the steam whistle, but he still didn't find any of the engines that were hiding from him. Thomas looked around and saw a funnel sticking up. Over some cargo trucks. It was long and tall. Who could it be? Said Thomas. Who has a long tall funnel like that? I can see you, Rheneas, puffed Thomas. Rheneas came out of hiding. Hello, Thomas, said Rheneas. You were very quick at finding me. Just then, Thomas heard a crunch and a bang. He looked round to see a short square funnel poking up from behind some rocks. Which narrow gauge engine has a short square funnel? Come out, said Thomas. We can hear you. It's Peter Sam. He crept out from behind the rocks smiling. Well done, Thomas, Peter Sam said. You found me. Just then, Thomas wrinkled his nose. I can smell cheese, said Thomas. That is a strange smell in a quarry. He puffed along the tracks to see where it was coming from. It's the Fat Controller eating a cheese sandwich. All the narrow gauge engines peeped their whistles with joy. As Thomas was leaving the Blue Mountain Quarry, he heard a noise coming from the tunnel and saw eyes watching him. Who can that be? Thought Thomas. The game of hide and peep has finished. Thomas looked back at the quarry and saw the narrow gauge engines were being Thomas looked back at the quarry and all the narrow gauge engines were being really useful doing their jobs. It must be a new engine. The engine moved forward and Thomas saw a bright green narrow gauge engine with the name Luke on his side. Hello, said Thomas. The little green engine looked shocked and disappeared back into the tunnel. Who is the mysterious small green engine in the tunnel? And why is he hiding?